Welcome to episode 7. So far, we've seen how the monarchy failed to address the financial difficulties that plagued the reign. One after the other, economists came in with their own recipe, trying to fix the financial situation, but they miserably failed. We've seen how Cluny de Nuit, who promised that would never, like other economists, he would not die in office because that role was an important and difficult one. And we've seen how also the recipe of Jacques Necker with the bonds and the lottery were not enough to tackle this giant issue. So we've left with Jacques Necker, who was dismissed, the Swiss economist. The French monarchy, desperate for a financial miracle, turned to another economist, hoping he would solve their growing problems. The last one in line was Calonne. Calonne had a completely different approach. He believed public debt wasn't a problem. He states, "Public debt is essential. It's absurd to think of reducing it. It would strangle us. We must continue increasing public debt. We must keep borrowing money." But there was a problem. Lenders were losing confidence. How could they be convinced to keep lending money? The answer, according to Calonne, was simple. Make them believe there was no financial crisis at all. The public must not suspect the enormous budget deficit. Instead, they had to see a monarchy that looked wealthier than ever. The solution? Spend, spend, spend. Spend on everything. Not to create jobs, as Keynes would later suggest in another context, but to create credit. The monarchy had to appear so rich that no one would hesitate to lend money. And so public spending soared, all to keep up the illusion that everything was going fine. One important detail to keep in mind, though, was that no one could find out the truth. That was the most important thing. So spending had to continue in every direction. And of course, the king and queen were pleased. The queen had long wanted a new Château, Saint-Cloud, but every time she brought it up, the king would tell her, "My dear, be patient. Given the current situation, we simply cannot afford it. But now, with Calonne in charge, we can afford it. Let's buy to the queen, Marie Antoinette, the Château of Saint-Cloud." And just like that, 6 million francs were spent. The queen also had other expensive projects, such as the construction of the Hamlet de la Reine, the queen's Hamlet, in the gardens of Versailles, where she could retreat and play at rural life. Basically, she would act as a peasant and play as she was living as a peasant. These lavish expenditures in the face of a deepening financial crisis contributed to her image as being out of touch with the struggles of ordinary people. To a large extent, Marie Antoinette was out of touch with the financial struggles of the majority of the French population. She was raised in the opulence of the Austrian court and then lived in the extreme luxury of Versailles, where the isolation of the monarchy from ordinary people was significant. Her extravagant spending on personal projects was known. However, she failed to grasp the depth of how her actions fueled resentment, making her a symbol of royal excess at a time when the country was on the brink of collapse. The parties at Versailles continued with grand balls, music, opera theater, concerts, spending everywhere. The court was happy, the bankers were happy, the stock market was rising, and the mood across the kingdom was one of excitement. Then came the summer of 1786. Calonne sat down to review the numbers. The results were, once again, staggering. Not even the repayment of the debt, just the interest alone was consuming 51% of the entire budget. For comparison, in the United States today, as of December 2024, the federal government paid $308 billion in interest on the national debt, which made up 17% of the total federal spending. But back then, budget looked very different. The next biggest expense was the military. 26% went to the army and the navy and fortifications. Social assistance and education, the monarchy spent just 2% on that. Still, no matter how one looked at it, dedicating 51% of the budget to debt interest was something unthinkable. Louis XVI must have thought, we've made another mistake. What is certain is that he dismissed Calonne. But by now the country has started to understand the truth, and the people were demanding something that would change everything. They wanted the king to convene the Estates General. The Estates General was an old institution dating back to the Middle Ages. Back then, French kings couldn't simply impose taxes whenever they wanted. No one would pay just because the king said so. If a medieval French king needed money, he had to call an assembly. Nobles, princes, barons, and lords, they would attend, along with bishops, archbishops, and other clergy. Merchants and wealthy city dwellers, those with money, were also part of it. These groups were known as the Three Estates. And to them, the king and his minister had to explain exactly why they needed money, how much, and for what purpose. The assembly would discuss, debate, and might approve the request. Without the Estates General, a medieval French king couldn't impose a single new tax. And of course, kings found this kind of control rather inconvenient. We started by saying that under Louis XVI, France was an absolute monarchy. By the 1600s, the monarchy had become absolute because the king had grown powerful enough to impose taxes without needing to call the Estates General. The last time he had been called was in 1614. For a century and a half after that, French kings ruled without ever convening this assembly. People hadn't forgotten that the Estates General had once existed. The nobles in particular remembered it well. They were part of the First Estate and had considerable influence. The clergy made up the Second Estate, while the Third Estate, which represented the common people, like peasants, urban workers, and the bourgeoisie, merchants, lawyers, and professionals, had little political power. Even so, the Estates General had to be called because the bourgeoisie, with their wealth and growing influence, played an important role in the economy and were demanding a say in the political system. By 1788, people were starting to ask, how long has it been since we last convened the Estates General? And look at where we ended up. The king couldn't continue like this. He had to listen to the country. The nobles, in particular, were demanding it, without realizing it that in just a few years they will face the guillotine alongside the king. We want the Estates General. We want to put the monarchy under control. Louis XVI had no choice but to promise that he would call them, and so he did. In his desperation, he even brought Necker, Jacques Necker, the previous economist, back as a finance minister. The king and Necker opened the Estates General hoping to discuss the budget deficit, but as they listened to what was being said, they were shocked to learn that the deficit was much worse than they realized because they did not have a solution. But even more pressing was the fact that this wasn't the most important issue. The real problem was that absolute monarchy could not continue. The country needed to be governed in a new way. The king had to accept that the Estates General should continue advising him and that it represented the will of the people. The king could no longer rule alone. At first, he hesitated, but then he tried to dissolve the Estates General. The assembly refused, saying, "We are the country, we are the people, we hold the power. The king is nothing without us." The king attempted to dissolve the assembly with the army, but Paris rose up. On July 14, 1789, the storming of the Bastille occurred. From that moment on, the Estates General became the National Assembly, the new parliament, which quickly took control as the only true legal power in France. The king went along with the new order, but deep down he couldn't bear the humiliation. He secretly began to plot with foreign powers, hoping that they would invade France. But the plot was discovered and both the king and the queen were arrested. The situation became extremely tense. People were terrified, and soon executions began. This was the start of the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. There were constant trials against anyone seen as guilty of conspiring with the king to undermine the Estates General, trying to restore absolute monarchy or profiting from the old system. The mood was, now it's time for the profiteers to be held accountable. If there's no money, it is because everyone took their share. Now the people will judge them. One day, a major trial was opened against the fermiers généraux, the tax collectors who had worked for the monarchy. All of them were tried together, and on May 8, 1794, 28 of these former fermiers généraux were executed. They had their head removed.